The mansion's grand entrance loomed, casting a long shadow over the quiet estate. Inside, the air was thick with tension, as if the house itself had sensed the weight of the decision about to unfold. A single figure, bent with age and illness, sat by a dimly lit desk, his frail hands trembling as they signed the most important document of his life. The room was eerily silent except for the faint rustle of paper. The man, once powerful and vibrant, now appeared fragile, barely able to sit up without assistance. His eyes, dull with the ravages of time, scanned the will one last time, ensuring every word was in place. It had taken him months to make this decision, months of emotional struggle, sleepless nights, and deep reflection on a lifetime of mistakes. As the ink dried, a faint but unmistakable sound echoed through the house. Footsteps. The woman he had once promised everything to, the woman who had stood beside him through years of wealth and luxury, walked into the room. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step a reminder of the wealth and power she had once enjoyed, but would soon lose. She smiled as she entered, her face an image of practiced grace, but her eyes betrayed a hint of calculation, as if already anticipating the next step in their charade of a perfect marriage. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the desk, where the will lay on the table, but she said nothing. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice smooth, masking the unease beneath. She had always been good at hiding her true feelings, a skill that had served her well in a marriage that was more about maintaining appearances than about love. He nodded slowly, his voice raspy, barely audible. "It's done." There was a brief silence before she moved closer, standing behind him, her fingers lightly brushing against his shoulder in a gesture that seemed more out of habit than affection. She wasn't there out of love, but out of necessity. The man, dying from a long, unforgiving illness, had been her ticket to a lavish lifestyle. The years had been filled with indulgence, expensive vacations, and the freedom to do as she pleased. But now, as his health failed, so too did the foundation of her carefully constructed world. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that this time, everything was different. The man, who had once been blinded by her beauty and charm, had seen her true nature, and now it was too late to change the course of what was about to unfold. As the woman stood there, her back straight, and her gaze fixed on the wall, she didn't notice the subtle shift in his posture. The quiet strength he had once had seemed to have faded away, but in these final moments, something far more powerful stirred within him. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant risking everything. He had waited far too long to make this choice. It wasn't just about money. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. It was about justice, and the realization that loyalty, kindness, and love had never come from the woman who stood in front of him. It had come from someone else entirely. The door creaked open just then, and the caretaker, a quiet figure who had spent countless hours tending to his needs, walked into the room. Her presence was calm, unassuming, but there was a strength to her that couldn't be ignored. Unlike the wife, who wore her wealth like a mask, the caretaker had always been genuine, soft-spoken but firm, attentive but never intrusive. She had been there when his body was at its weakest, when no one else cared. She had witnessed his most vulnerable moments, wiped his brow in the heat of fevers, and listened to his rambling thoughts when the pain became too much. And in return, he had come to rely on her in ways that the wife had never earned. The wife barely acknowledged her as she entered, too focused on her own plans. She had already begun to think of how she could turn the man's dwindling fortune into a legacy for herself. After all, she had been his partner in life, his wife. She was entitled to everything. The husband, weak but resolute, looked from one to the other. His decision was made. And though his voice was barely a whisper, the words carried with them a finality that would reverberate through both women's lives forever. "I've made my choice," he said slowly, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "I leave everything to her." The words hung in the air like a bombshell, heavy and unmistakable. His wife's breath caught in her throat as she turned to him, confusion quickly turning to disbelief. Her mouth opened and closed, as if trying to comprehend the gravity of what she had just heard. She had spent years maneuvering for this moment, thinking that his fortune was as good as hers. But in that instant, everything she had ever believed in was shattered. The caretaker remained still, her expression unreadable. She had not asked for this, had never expected it. But in that moment, as the dying man's eyes met hers, she understood. She had given him the one thing no amount of money could buy: genuine care, selflessness, and loyalty. She hadn't come for the riches, hadn't sought out his wealth or status. She had been there for him when no one else had. And now, she would be the one to carry on his legacy. The wife's eyes flared with fury, and the room seemed to shrink with the intensity of her anger. How could he do this? How could he take everything she had worked so hard for and give it to someone else? She had been there with him through thick and thin, hadn't she? She had been the one by his side when he was in the prime of his life, when the world was at his feet. But in this final moment, everything changed. She stepped forward, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "You can't do this. I'm your wife. I deserve this. I've stood by you, through everything. I've put up with your illness, with your weakness, all for this moment. And you give it all to her." Her voice cracked, the anger bubbling up into a sharp edge of desperation. But the dying man's eyes remained calm, unwavering. There was no longer any room for negotiation. He had made his decision, and nothing she could say would change it. The wife's breath came faster now, her mind racing as she realized the truth of the situation. In that one irrevocable moment, she had lost everything. What she had believed to be a lifetime of love and wealth had been nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. The caretaker, standing quietly in the background, shifted slightly. She had no desire for the drama unfolding before her. She had spent her life serving others, not seeking the spotlight. But now, in the wake of the husband's final decision, she was no longer just a caretaker. She was the one who had been chosen, and it was a position she would never have asked for, but would accept with quiet dignity. The air was thick with the unspoken words hanging between the two women, as the dying man's declaration reverberated through the silence of the room. The wife's hand trembled as it reached for the back of a chair, her knuckles turning white as her grip tightened. She could feel the world around her shifting, tilting, and suddenly, all the money, all the material possessions she had so meticulously cultivated seemed meaningless. She had spent years carefully crafting an image of a perfect wife, the perfect partner, the perfect woman who deserved every last cent of his fortune. But in this moment, she realized that image had been a fragile illusion, ready to crumble. Her eyes darted from the man to the caretaker, searching for any sign of betrayal, any hint that the woman standing quietly beside her had been complicit in this shocking betrayal. But the caretaker's face was calm, almost serene. There was no malice, no smug satisfaction, just a quiet resolve. It was as if she had known all along, as if she had expected this moment long before the husband had even spoken the words aloud. The wife, on the other hand, was falling apart, each word, each breath like a nail being driven into the coffin of her carefully constructed reality. I don't understand," the wife finally whispered, her voice breaking. "You promised me everything. We had a life together. And now you choose her. She's just your nurse, your caretaker. She has no place here. I'm your wife. I've given you everything. And yet, you give it all to her." The husband's gaze never wavered. Despite the frailty in his body, his mind had never been clearer. He knew what he had to do. His decision was final. And no matter how much the wife pleaded, no matter how many times she tried to remind him of their past, he would not falter. He had been trapped in a web of deceit for far too long, a web spun by a woman who had shown him nothing but selfishness and indifference in the face of his sickness. The caretaker, standing at a distance, had seen the unraveling of the marriage from a different perspective. She had been there long before the wife entered the picture. She had been there when the man's health first started to fail, when his wife was more concerned with shopping sprees and extravagant dinners than she was with the man who was slowly fading before her eyes. The wife's indifference had been hard to miss, and over time, the caretaker had witnessed how the husband's need for genuine companionship and care had slowly shifted her place in his life. At first, it had been just a professional relationship, nurse and patient. But over the months, and then the years, something deeper had developed. She wasn't the one who had sought anything beyond the care she provided. She didn't want money or status. She didn't even want the title of wife. She simply wanted to be there for him, as he had been there for so many others. But as the days passed and the man's health deteriorated, it became clear to both of them that their bond was something far beyond duty. It was respect, compassion, and yes, even love in its purest, most selfless form. The wife, meanwhile, had grown increasingly distant, her attentions focused on his fortune and the comfortable lifestyle it provided. She had grown resentful of the fact that he no longer had the energy for her, that his health had forced him to rely on others, especially the caretaker. It was hard for her to accept that someone who had spent their days in the shadows, someone who had never sought to be noticed, had managed to capture her husband's heart in a way she never had. And it was even harder for her to swallow the fact that her place as the sole beneficiary of his wealth had been usurped by this woman she had always seen as beneath her. As the husband's breathing grew shallow, the wife's face contorted with frustration and anger. Her voice rose in a pitch that was nearly frantic. "I've put up with your sickness, with your weakness, with your inability to do anything. And now you reward her with everything. After everything we've been through, after everything I've given you, this is how you repay me." But the husband didn't answer. He simply closed his eyes, each breath more labored than the last. His decision had been made, and the time for words had passed. The truth of his feelings was there, unspoken but undeniable. He had seen the truth in the caretaker's eyes, in the quiet devotion with which she had cared for him. She had never once complained, never once sought anything from him except the opportunity to provide comfort in his final days. The wife had taken him for granted, seeing him only as a source of wealth and comfort rather than a person in need of care and companionship. The husband had finally realized that he deserved more than a life of empty promises and material gain. The room felt colder now, the silence heavier. The wife's pleas grew more desperate, but the caretaker's expression remained the same, calm, almost detached from the scene before her. She had never asked for any of this. She had never imagined that she would one day be standing here, in the place of the wife, receiving what was meant to be her husband's legacy. But as the minutes stretched on, it became increasingly clear that this was no longer about wealth or possessions. It was about something far more profound. It was about trust, loyalty, and the raw truth of human connection. The wife, who had once seen herself as the center of this world, now found herself on the outside, staring into the void of a life that no longer belonged to her. The inheritance she had assumed was hers by right was slipping away, not because of any legal maneuvering or trickery, but because of the simple fact that her marriage had never been built on love. It had been built on convenience, on status, and on the things that money could buy. As the final moments of the man's life approached, the caretaker moved closer, offering a gentle, almost reverent touch to his frail hand. She had always known this moment would come, though she never dreamed it would be like this. She had never wanted any of the wealth or status that would come from his passing. She simply wanted to make sure he was comfortable, that he was cared for, that he felt valued in his final days. But now, as she looked down at him, she realized that he had left her something far greater than money. He had left her his trust, his gratitude, and his love in a way that no amount of gold could ever replicate. The wife's face contorted in disbelief, but the caretaker remained steady. There was nothing she could say to make it right, no words that could undo the years of manipulation and indifference that had defined the wife's relationship with the man. In the end, the dying man had chosen the one who had truly cared, and as the wife stood there, powerless to change the course of events. She could only watch as everything she had once believed was stripped away. The silence in the room stretched on, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The wife's anger simmered beneath her surface, but there was an unsettling calmness to her now. It was as though the finality of the moment had begun to settle in. Her face, still pale with shock, began to shift into something darker, something colder. She had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate, to twist any situation to her advantage. But now she stood at the edge of an abyss, her grip on her once comfortable life slipping further away with each passing second. She turned away from the dying man, her back stiff with pride, as she tried to gather the pieces of her shattered composure. Her voice, once smooth and confident, was now laced with an edge of desperation. "You think this will be easy," she muttered under her breath, barely audible. "You think you've won." But the caretaker, standing quietly in the corners, said nothing. There was no need for words, no need for reassurances. She had seen enough of the world to understand that sometimes silence was the most powerful response. It was never about winning or losing. It was about doing what was right, even when no one was looking. The husband, now only a shadow of the man he had once been, let out a labored breath and looked up at the caretaker one last time. His eyes, though tired and dimmed by illness, held a clarity that had eluded him for so long. This decision was not one made out of spite, nor was it meant to be a dramatic gesture of rebellion. It was a decision born from a deep understanding of his life, a life filled with luxury, but one that had been devoid of the very thing he needed most, genuine connection. The caretaker had never once treated him as a means to an end, never once glanced at him with anything other than compassion, and in return, she had earned his trust, his respect, and ultimately, his heart. The wife could not understand this, could not fathom how a man who had given her everything, the grand house, the expensive jewelry, the vacations, the high society life, could turn away from her in his final moments. To her, love had always been a transaction, something that could be measured by the things she had accumulated. But for the husband, love had been something far simpler, more profound, and far more human. He had been desperate for someone who saw him for who he truly was, someone who cared for him, not for his money, but for his soul. The wife, unable to bear the weight of her own failure, walked toward the door, her steps slow but determined. She needed air, space to think, to plan her next move. She had not come this far to be left empty-handed. The riches were hers, she told herself, her mind racing to figure out how she could take back what she had lost. There were always options, always ways to manipulate, to bend things to her will. She had built her empire on the belief that no one could outwit her, no one could take what she had worked so hard for. But now, standing in the silence of the room, she began to feel a sense of unease creeping over her. She opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors with an almost mechanical rhythm. She paused for a moment in the hallway, listening to the soft murmur of voices behind her. But as she stood there, staring down the long, empty corridor, something deep inside her began to shift. It was the nagging feeling that she could no longer outrun, the realization that her game had come to an end. She had played her cards, and now, the house of cards was crumbling. Meanwhile, the caretaker remained with the husband, standing silently beside him as his breaths grew shallower. She had been there through it all, through the quiet, mundane moments and the intense, heart-wrenching ones. She had seen the man who had once ruled with power and pride become a fragile figure, clinging to life as his body deteriorated. But through it all, her loyalty had never wavered. She had cared for him not because of any obligation, but because of a deep, quiet love born from respect. As the husband's eyes fluttered closed, the caretaker gently took his hand in hers, her fingers brushing against his in a final tender gesture. The man had lived a life of wealth and privilege, but in these last moments, he had found something far more valuable: peace. In the quiet of the room, the caretaker watched as his spirit slowly slipped away, her heart heavy with the weight of both sorrow and relief. This moment, as painful as it was, had brought clarity. The decision had been made, and the husband's last wish had been carried out. The world outside could never understand what had transpired in these walls, but she knew the truth. She had been there, through it all. And now, the rest of the world would have to reckon with the choices made in the quiet of this dying man's heart. The wife, still seething with anger and resentment, had no idea how profoundly her life would change from that moment on. She had assumed that the wealth, the inheritance, and the status she had long depended on would be hers forever. But in her blind pursuit of materialism, she had overlooked the one thing that had made the dying man's life worth living: genuine connection. She had given nothing but empty promises, and now, in the end, it was the caretaker who had earned everything. The wife would never understand why the man had chosen her over the decades of loyalty and devotion that she had claimed to have provided. But she would come to learn that some things, some connections, were beyond her control. As the husband's passing was quietly recorded, the lawyer, who had been a silent observer of the events unfolding, left the room with a sense of foreboding. He had known this day would come, but even he couldn't have predicted how dramatically it would unfold. He had witnessed countless wills, countless inheritances, but this one would be different. He could already hear the whispers of the estate's future, whispers of the wife's legal challenges, of the caretaker's sudden rise to prominence. The caretaker stood in the corner, quietly taking in the weight of the moment. She hadn't asked for any of this, but now, as the ink dried on the man's last wishes, she realized that everything had changed. She had never expected to be thrust into the spotlight, but as the executor of his estate and the inheritor of his fortune, she would have to navigate a world that would no longer view her as just a caretaker. The mansion, the money, the legacy, all of it was now in her hands. But even as she stood there, the reality of her new position was beginning to settle in. There would be challenges ahead, legal battles, media scrutiny, perhaps even betrayal. The wife would fight for what she believed was rightfully hers, and the world would question how such a decision could have been made. But the caretaker wasn't concerned with that. She had never sought wealth or recognition. She had simply done what was right, what was necessary. And in the end, she had been the one who had earned the greatest prize: the husband's final, unwavering trust. And with that, she stepped into the next chapter of her life, prepared to carry the legacy forward with the same quiet dignity that had defined her every action. Days passed, and the grand mansion that had once echoed with the laughter of parties and the bustling of servants now stood in a quiet, almost eerie stillness. The rooms were filled with a heavy silence, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to come. The wife, now out of the picture and nursing her wounds, had retreated into the shadows, her pride and anger burning within her like an unquenchable fire. Her plans, her expectations, had all been dashed in one fateful moment. The life she had envisioned for herself, a life built on wealth and status, was slipping through her fingers faster than she could grasp it. At first, she told herself that this was just a temporary setback. The money was still hers by right, wasn't it? She had been the one who had stood by the husband for years, the one who had made all the right connections, attended all the right events, and provided the public image of the perfect wife. She had given everything for this life, hadn't she? She couldn't fathom that it had all been in vain. How could he possibly choose someone else over her, someone who had never shared in their wealth, their lifestyle, their history? But as the days turned into weeks and the paperwork began to surface, she realized that her fight was not going to be an easy one. The lawyer, who had once been a confidant in her schemes, now became a distant figure, an impartial observer of her unraveling world. The legal challenges came faster than she had anticipated. The will was clear. Her name was nowhere to be found in the inheritance, and the caretaker, the woman who had spent years in the shadows, had suddenly become the sole beneficiary of everything. Her lawyer assured her that there was always a way to contest the will, that there was a chance she could regain what was hers. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be easy. The public would side with the caretaker. The media would have a field day with her story. The wronged, rich widow fighting for what was rightfully hers. It would only paint her in a darker light. No one would care about the years she had spent supporting the husband through his wealth and health issues. The world didn't care about the sacrifices she had made to maintain the facade of the perfect marriage. No, they would rally around the caretaker, the quiet, selfless woman who had done nothing but care for the man in his final days. The wife sat alone in her empty home, the walls now echoing the hollow emptiness she felt inside. She ran her fingers through her hair, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of her own mistakes pressing down on her. She had built her entire existence on the belief that she deserved everything. She had come to think of herself as untouchable, above the fray, above the consequences. But now she had been stripped bare, exposed for who she truly was. Her wealth, her beauty, her charm, none of it had mattered. The truth was, she had been playing a game all along, and she had lost. Meanwhile, in the mansion, life moved on with an unsettling normalcy. The caretaker, now in possession of the estate, had quickly taken control. She didn't seek the limelight. She never had. But there was no denying the power shift that had occurred. The lawyers, the accountants, even the servants who had once been at her command now looked to her for guidance. She was the one who made the decisions, who ensured that the family business continued running smoothly. The sudden responsibility was overwhelming at times, but she never let it show. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she always had. She had never asked for any of this. She had only wanted to do what was right by the man who had trusted her. And now she was determined to honor that trust to the fullest. As the legal battles dragged on, the caretaker remained a figure of quiet strength, never flaunting her newfound wealth or position. But the challenges were never far behind. The wife, determined to take back what she believed was rightfully hers, began her fight with a vengeance. She called upon every contact, every favor she could muster. The media began to follow her every move, and soon her story was plastered across tabloids and social media. She painted herself as the victim of a cruel, unjust betrayal, her cries of "This is my life" ringing out to anyone who would listen. But the more she fought, the more the public began to turn on her. Her image, carefully crafted over the years, began to crack. The media turned their attention to the caretaker, who, despite being thrust into the spotlight, remained humble and gracious. Her story was one of true devotion, of loyalty and compassion, of a woman who had given everything for someone else without asking for anything in return. As weeks passed, the wife's bitterness only grew. The anger in her heart began to harden into something darker. She had no intention of giving up. She would fight for what she deserved. But the more she fought, the more she realized she was losing herself in the process. Her once pristine reputation was tarnished beyond recognition, and she could feel the walls closing in. She began to make reckless decisions, attacking anyone who dared to question her claim to the fortune. Friends, colleagues, even distant family members. Anyone who had once stood by her was now a target for her wrath. She alienated everyone who had been close to her, isolating herself in her own bitterness. The mansion, once filled with laughter and luxury, now felt like a prison, a place where she was forced to confront the ugly truth of her actions. The caretaker, on the other hand, carried on with the day-to-day business of running the estate, all the while dealing with the mounting pressure of a legal battle she never wanted. But with every passing day, the people around her began to respect her more. The workers who had once viewed her as just another hired hand now saw her as a leader, a woman who had earned her place not through manipulation or cunning, but through genuine care and hard work. As the weeks turned into months, the wife's legal challenge faltered. The more she clung to her hope of regaining the fortune, the more she realized that it was slipping further and further away. The caretaker's will had been airtight, her bond with the husband unassailable. And with each passing legal victory, the wife's resolve began to erode. One day, as she sat in her lawyer's office, staring at the piles of paperwork that seemed to mock her, she came to a painful realization. The battle was over. She had lost. Not just the fortune, but the respect, the love, and the life she had once believed was hers for the taking. The wealth that had once seemed so important now felt hollow, a distant memory of a life that had never been as fulfilling as she had convinced herself. In the quiet of the mansion, the caretaker sat in the study, a letter in front of her. It was from the wife, her final plea for reconciliation. It was not the first letter she had received, but this one was different. There was no anger in it, no demands. It was simply a plea for understanding, for forgiveness. The caretaker hesitated before she placed the letter aside. She had never wished ill on the wife, but forgiveness could only go so far. In the end, the wife had to reckon with the consequences of her own choices. As the caretaker looked out the window, the sun setting on the vast estate, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She had been given everything she needed, not in wealth, but in integrity. She had chosen the right path, not the easiest. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, she was prepared to face whatever came next. In the end, she had learned that loyalty, love, and truth were the true legacies to leave behind, not the riches that others so desperately craved. Months passed, and the world outside the mansion moved on, oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding within its walls. The caretaker, now fully entrenched in the life she never imagined for herself, continued to navigate the complexities of her new reality. She wasn't seeking recognition. She wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone. Her focus remained clear, rooted in the values that had always guided her: compassion, integrity, and the quiet belief that people are more important than the things they possess. But as the weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, the quiet victories were often overshadowed by the challenges that continued to arise. The wife, despite her legal defeat, refused to fade into the background. Her campaign against the caretaker's inheritance continued, although each attempt to undermine the will was met with failure. She had become a figure of public sympathy at first, her portrayal as the grieving, betrayed widow fueling the media's thirst for scandal. But as time wore on, the public's perception shifted. The wife's increasingly erratic behavior, her bitterness spilling over in interviews and public statements, began to overshadow the story of her victimhood. More and more, she was seen for what she truly was: someone who had taken advantage of a man's love and wealth without ever giving anything of real substance in return. In the quiet, sunlit study of the mansion, the caretaker often sat at the desk, sorting through papers, making decisions that would ensure the estate's smooth operation. She didn't think much of the wealth. It had never been the point. Instead, she focused on what mattered, ensuring that the legacy left behind was one of respect, dignity, and care for others. She worked with a small team of trusted individuals, many of whom had been with the estate for years before her sudden rise to prominence. They all shared one thing in common: they respected her. She never gave orders from a place of arrogance or entitlement. Her strength came from her humility and her willingness to listen, to learn, and to act with kindness. Despite the weight of her newfound responsibilities, there was a quiet comfort in knowing she was living a life true to herself. She spent much of her days ensuring the business side of the estate was running smoothly, but she never lost sight of the bigger picture. She'd started small, caring for the man in his final years, but had ended up inheriting far more than she had ever anticipated. Still, it never felt like a burden. It felt like a continuation of the quiet service she had always offered, albeit on a much larger scale. The mansion, once a symbol of excess and entitlement, was beginning to feel like a home again. The caretakers, the workers, and even the occasional visitors who still came to the estate began to notice the shift in energy. Where once there had been an air of tension, of wealth-driven posturing, there was now a subtle, peaceful rhythm to the way the estate was run. The house was still grand, still filled with the trappings of wealth, but it no longer felt empty or oppressive. The caretaker's influence was subtle but undeniable. It wasn't in the lavish parties or grand displays, but in the simple, everyday acts of kindness and respect that now pervaded the estate. As for the wife, her decline continued. The media, who had once painted her as the tragic figure in this story, now began to report on her increasingly erratic behavior. Her attempts to regain the estate, to force her way back into the husband's world, only seemed to deepen the divide between her and the rest of the world. She had once believed that wealth and status were the keys to everything, but now she was finding that they were the very things that had led to her downfall. The more she fought, the more she alienated those who had once supported her. The sympathy she had once received began to wane, replaced by pity and contempt. The legal battles had taken their toll on her health, her appearance, her mind. Her once carefully crafted image of the perfect wife, gracious, poised, untouchable, had been shattered. She was no longer the glamorous widow seeking justice. She was now a woman consumed by bitterness, a woman who had lost everything she held dear. The more the caretaker stepped into the light, the more the wife retreated into the shadows. There was no room for her in this new world, and she was beginning to realize it. Yet, despite it all, she could not stop herself from clinging to the hope that she could somehow turn things around. She couldn't let go of the life she had known, couldn't accept that the power had shifted permanently. She continued to fight, but each legal document, each failed attempt to reclaim what she felt was hers, only deepened her sense of hopelessness. The mansion, which had once been a fortress of her dreams, now felt like a distant memory. She had become a ghost in her own life, lingering in the spaces where she once had control, but no longer did. One evening, as the caretaker sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. It had been a difficult journey, one filled with unexpected challenges and painful losses, but it had also been a journey of growth. She had gone from being an invisible figure in the background to standing at the forefront of something much larger than herself. She had inherited not just the wealth and property, but the responsibility to honor the memory of the man she had cared for, the man who had trusted her above all else. The caretaker knew that the world would continue to judge her, to speculate about the events that had led her here. She would never be able to change their opinions, but that was no longer her concern. The only thing that mattered was what she could control, how she chose to live her life moving forward. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong or seeking redemption from a world that would never fully understand. It was about being true to herself, about honoring the trust that had been placed in her. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a person who had made choices, who had taken risks, and who had lived a life of integrity, when so many others had failed to do the same. As the days turned into months, and the legal battle slowly came to an end, the caretaker began to make her mark on the world in a new way. She began to use the wealth left to her to invest in causes she believed in, causes that aligned with her values. She worked with organizations that helped those in need, helped build communities, and created opportunities for people who had never been given a chance. She made sure that the legacy of the man who had trusted her would be carried forward in a way that would benefit others, not just herself. And as for the wife, she eventually faded from the public eye, a cautionary tale of what can happen when greed and pride outweigh the things that truly matter. She had lost everything, not because the world had taken it from her, but because she had refused to see that the life she had clung to was never really hers to begin with. In the end, the mansion stood as a monument to the choices made within its walls, choices that, for better or for worse, had defined the lives of those who lived there. And as the caretaker walked through its halls, the weight of the past behind her, she knew that she had created something far more meaningful than wealth. She had created a legacy of care, of dignity, and of respect for the things that truly mattered in life. The mansion, once a symbol of excess, had been transformed into a place of healing, a place where love, loyalty, and integrity would forever hold more value than any material possession. Time had a way of softening even the hardest blows, and with each passing month, the story of the dying husband, his gold-digger wife, and the humble caretaker seemed to fade into the background of the public's collective memory. The wife, once a figure of wealth and influence, now drifted through life like a shadow of her former self, her influence waning, her attempts to reclaim what had been taken from her growing increasingly desperate and futile. She had burned every bridge she once relied on, alienated every ally who had once supported her. What had started as a battle for her rightful inheritance had spiraled into a public spectacle of failure, and the world began to move on, leaving her behind. In stark contrast, the caretaker had slowly but surely transformed the estate into a place of refuge, of new beginnings. What had been a mansion filled with the hollow sounds of empty grandeur was now a home brimming with life, purpose, and a deep sense of belonging. It wasn't about the wealth that had been inherited. It was about the integrity she brought to the life she had never expected to lead. She poured herself into the estate, not for the riches or the status, but for the people, for the legacy of care and compassion that had been left to her. She didn't need the world to recognize her. She wasn't interested in public accolades or fame. Her reward was in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she was making a difference. Slowly, she began to open the mansion's doors to the community, hosting events that focused on giving back, on supporting causes that were close to her heart. She created scholarships for underprivileged youth, funded healthcare initiatives for those who could not afford it, and started programs for women and children who needed a safe space to rebuild their lives. She never sought to be seen as a hero, but her actions spoke louder than any words could. The community began to take notice. At first, it was just a ripple, small acts of kindness noticed by a few. But as time passed, the ripple became a wave, and the mansion, once a symbol of decadence and self-interest, became a beacon of hope, of change, and of what could happen when someone truly cared. The caretaker didn't set out to be a philanthropist, but in the process of honoring her own values, she had become one. People began to see her as someone who had given herself wholeheartedly to the idea of improving the lives of others, and in doing so, she had unknowingly built a community of people who trusted her, who believed in her vision. The estate was no longer just a piece of land. It was a foundation for new beginnings, a sanctuary for those who needed it most. Meanwhile, the wife, who had once ruled her life with ruthless determination, found herself wandering aimlessly. She was no longer the center of attention. Her name no longer appeared in the newspapers or on the gossip pages. The world had moved on, and in her solitude, she began to feel the weight of her choices. She had fought so fiercely for the wealth she believed was hers by right, but she had failed to recognize the things that truly mattered: relationships, loyalty, love, and trust. All she had left were empty memories of a life built on false promises, a hollow existence where material wealth meant more than human connection. She had spent years building walls around herself, but now those walls felt suffocating. The mansion she had once called home was now a distant memory, a place she could no longer visit, a symbol of everything she had lost. She had no one left to turn to, no one who would stand by her side. Her old friends, the ones who had once admired her for her beauty and wealth, had distanced themselves, tired of her bitterness, tired of the constant self-pity. They had seen through her facade, and now she was left with nothing but the remnants of her own pride and regret. In the solitude of her small apartment, the wife often found herself staring at the walls, lost in thought. She had tried everything to regain control, every legal tactic, every emotional appeal, every attempt to play the victim. But in the end, the fight had only torn her apart. She had underestimated the power of love, of loyalty, and of what it meant to truly be there for someone. She had spent her entire life assuming that power and wealth were the keys to happiness, but now she was confronted with the cold, hard truth. They were empty without the people who mattered. In the quiet moments, when the noise of the world subsided, she would remember the man she had once called her husband, and the caretaker who had loved him in a way she could never understand. She wondered, sometimes, if she could have changed things if she had been different, if she had shown more care, more warmth. But it was too late for that now. Time had passed, and with it, her chance to make amends. But the caretaker, undeterred by the media's fleeting attention or the former wife's unrelenting bitterness, continued to build the life that had been entrusted to her. With every act of kindness, with every change she made, the mansion began to feel less like the place of excess it once was and more like a place of rebirth. She invited those who had been overlooked, artists, writers, families struggling to make ends meet, into the fold. The mansion became a haven, a place where people could reconnect with themselves, where they could find peace in a world that often felt overwhelming. One day, as she walked through the gardens that surrounded the estate, watching the workers plant new trees and flowers that would bloom in the years to come, the caretaker felt a deep sense of gratitude. She wasn't just rebuilding a house, she was rebuilding a legacy that, despite all the trials, was founded on something far more lasting than money. The mansion was now a living, breathing testament to what it meant to live with integrity, with purpose, and with compassion. It was no longer just a symbol of wealth, but a symbol of transformation. The caretaker had, in many ways, become a symbol of resilience herself, someone who had come into a life of unimaginable wealth, not to take from it, but to give back. And as the years continued to pass, she would often stand at the window, looking out at the grounds that stretched beyond her, remembering the man who had once been the love of her life. His absence was felt deeply, but his legacy was alive in everything she did. In his final moments, he had entrusted her with something far more valuable than his fortune. He had given her the chance to make a real difference in the world, and she was determined to honor that gift every day. The mansion, once a place of cold calculation and empty luxury, had been reborn. It was no longer defined by the money that had flowed through its halls, but by the love, the care, and the community that had been nurtured within. It had become a place where the past was acknowledged, but not allowed to define the future. And as the caretaker looked forward, she knew that the greatest legacy of all was not the estate, the wealth, or the title. It was the love and care she had given to others, the difference she had made, and the lives she had touched along the way. In the end, it was never about who had the most money or who had won the inheritance. It was about the choices made along the way, and the lives that had been shaped by those choices. And the mansion, standing proud and unyielding against the changing world, was proof that, in the end, love and integrity always had the power to rise above everything else.